Welcome to episode 68 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian in my 13th year, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, by my interview guests, and our listeners who check in with the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. When it comes to being a school librarian in the time of COVID-19, I am committed to keeping the focus of this podcast always on our profession, our programs, and our libraries. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to listeners Lindsay in DC, Amanda in Louisiana, Maria in Connecticut, and again to Lorraine in Australia for your COVID updates from the other side of the world. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions, either on Facebook, Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, and I'm afraid for most of you this will have to be a home address as our schools are no longer open, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. It is worth mentioning that now in staying connected with our virtual PLN has become more important than ever. I heard an interesting distinction made on a podcast I was listening to today, and that is we are practicing physical distancing, not social distancing. While keeping quarantined and closing ourselves physically off from others, it is essential that we are mindful to keep socially connected. My iPhone wanted to tell me today just how much screen time I had experienced last week and how much it had increased. And I didn't look and I didn't care because we're shut down and we're sheltered in place. But that doesn't mean that I can't continue to do my job and keep my podcast going. And now for today's episode, Communal Space. Is it strange that I should be dwelling on something as seemingly petty as communal space when currently our school library programs are experiencing one of the most daunting challenges as our buildings are closed and our schools are closed for the rest of the school year. And yet, when our schools are open, communal space is something which impacts us regularly, daily, often. And regardless of your program, what grade level you teach, we face challenges because our teaching space is everyone's teaching space. And I will do my best today to keep it as upbeat and positive, but I imagine some of you will be nodding because this is a topic we can all relate. The first 9 years of my teaching career, I taught in a fairly standard-sized high school classroom and in a series of different high schools. And to a 22-year-old rookie just happy to have a job, I was glad to have a room all of my own. And I had proudly hung a flag from my alma mater, the University of Michigan, over my desk. I decorated my room with posters, and I covered my wall space and bulletin boards with pictures I had taken of my students and the school activities we had done over the year. When I acquired 2 kittens, there was a photo gallery which appeared on top of one of my file cabinets. My desk drawers and my closets contained all of my supplies, and I could, with all confidence, be assured that the next day, when I unlocked the door and walked in my room, that everything would be as I left it. Now, do you remember your very first library? I walked into mine 13 years ago. The space took my breath away. I surveyed all around me and thought, wow, I cannot believe this is all mine. It's really silly to think about because I quickly discovered, as we all do, that I had only partial say over the goings-on in my space. I was simply the keeper of the library. I was the custodian of all therein. And there were times I felt more like a security guard, just keeping track of our collection, an unwitting hostess for every staff gathering and luncheon and celebration. And sometimes I felt more like a parent who had left the house only to find when I'd returned that mayhem ensued, and I was left cleaning up the mess. Regardless, our libraries experience every day, hourly, what classroom teachers only experience once or twice a year, perhaps back to school night and parent-teacher conferences. You ever walk through the halls in the hours which precede open house or conferences? The teachers are frantically racing around last minute because very shortly the parents will be filing in and judging the classroom as much as they judge their child's teacher. Well, that's us every day. I know this came up during my episode on occupational hazards. Who knew our job could be so dangerous? We are subject to the opinions of everyone who steps foot in our libraries. Deservedly or not, we are on the receiving end of unsolicited comments every time a teacher walks in or out or through our libraries. And because our libraries are very much a reflection of the librarian, it's hard not to take the smallest of criticisms personally. And then there's scheduling. Our space is more commonly regarded as a multi-purpose room. Like the family member who has the biggest house, it is the default host for every family gathering. So too is our library space. Lunch enrichment, such as yoga, the knitting club, the spillover room when school photos are being taken, and when PD is being offered, after school homework help. Various clubs, evening meetings, PTO, community gatherings, scouting meetings. As a proud band parent, initially I was thrilled when the 5th grade instrumental program met in the library after my morning classes ended and before my afternoon classes arrived. I was thrilled. Until the brass instruments started emptying their spit valves all over my Berber carpeting. And then there's testing season, something which often dictates building use ahead of our curriculum priorities. Because I've worked in libraries which have also housed a computer lab, I have had to be bumped and teach in the classrooms. It goes without saying that our communal spaces are ripe for the spread of germs. When norovirus hits or the flu, our library is frequented by the entire schools. Germs are not contained or localized. When there is lice in the kindergarten classes, we need to know. When a kid comes to school sick with pink eye, that's usually the same day their class comes up to the library. I came across a really clever blog post a while back, and I made sure to save it for this episode. And the blog post is called The Sassy Bibliophile, and it's written by Sonia Schultz, who is a high school librarian in Texas. And she posted this article on August 16th of 2019. And she wrote, "Clever Wickets, or Things They Don't Teach You in Library School." I'll be sure to include a link in the show notes. And she said when it comes to dealing with these kinds of impositions, quote, "None of these infractions are worth stressing to levels that affect your health. None of these infractions are worth losing or damaging work relationships. I urge you, don't type that email, don't storm into that office, don't vent in the teacher's lounge until you are calm and rational. In fact, don't vent in the lounge ever, period. It just isn't a good look." Unquote. And this is Amy. I'm not saying you shouldn't do anything, but I'm hoping that listening to this episode, you will be able to reflect on your own program and we'll be able to find ways for you to proactively implement certain procedures and then also respond in ways that are productive rather than causing people to resent you and how your library is run. Making friends with the office staff, the custodial team, and the building engineers is key. These are miracle workers who will solve major issues and minor inconveniences for us. Regular, open, and collegial conversation with these people helps tremendously. Ask for extra trash bins, extra garbage bags, antibacterial wipes, and even a carpet sweeper if one can be spared. A listener gave me this idea earlier in the season, and my students fight over who gets to run the sweeper and wipe down the tables after lunch groups disband. And it goes without saying that There are great things that can happen when people come into our libraries. And this is a perfect opportunity to showcase all of our beautiful collections, to showcase our brand new books and the things that we're doing with our students, to our school leadership, to our parents, and the wider community. Offer to host exhibits, art shows. The library can showcase these because we offer the largest room in the building. Have the students perform their living museum projects. When classes present in front of the families, our library space is ideal because our families can see our programs. They're reminded of how much the libraries enrich their students' school experience. And now, my interview with Sara Marshall. I'm so excited to be introducing you to someone today. Sara Marshall is someone I have found such inspiration from. We are on Facebook together. I follow her on Facebook, and she has a group on Facebook. And Sara Marshall, I'd love to pick your brain about something that all of us deal with, and that is communal space. Before we get started, because we are in a time of corona, the schools in the United States are closed. They're closed around the world. What are you doing to support the students in your building and the staff in your building during remote learning?
Well, per our district, I am just trying to give some kind of enrichment activities right now. We're not really allowed to start distance learning until April 6th. And so they've said, hey, you can, give them ideas for websites or activities that they can do for at home that really are just for fun. So I'm trying to post some of those on my library Facebook page, and I'm also trying to reach out to students and doing some Zoom chats. And I've done a few videos with stories, and I even made like a virtual readers cafe video the other day just to kind of engage with my students in a different way.
Nice. Do you use an LMS like Canva or Schoology or Seesaw, or how are you sharing out with your students?
I'm using an unlisted YouTube channel.
Nice.
And my Facebook platform.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I do want to share your wonderful news. Please tell us what happened. I realize this feels like a very long time ago, but you were given some very special recognition.
Yes, I was voted the 2019-2020 Teacher of the Year at my site.
Well, and you were given quite a celebration. It was very festive, and I think a lot of librarians in our buildings recognize that sometimes we're not even regarded as teachers. So to have this recognition, in my opinion, what a feather in your cap that you are clearly making your presence not only known but appreciated by all the educators in your building.
Thank you so much.
Well, and I love the theme. They decorated your library in a very hungry caterpillar theme.
Yes.
Did it get to stay up? I hope.
I kept some of it. Yes, I kept the caterpillar that was made out of like little pom-poms on the wall.
It was so sweet. And again, when you're a school librarian, sometimes our battle is just to remain relevant and part of the conversation. And you're like, hello, I'm over here. So you clearly are doing a lot of things right. Tell us, I know a little bit about you, but for listeners who are just meeting you for the first time, tell us about your library.
All right, I work in a K through 5 building. We actually just added one pre-K class this year. So I serve pre-K through 5th grade. I see kindergarten through 5th grade each once a week. I teach 6 classes a day for 45 minutes, and it's a lot of fun.
and you're busy. Are you on a Monday through Friday or an ABCD day?
Yes, Monday through Friday. So I see each grade level every day.
Got it. Wonderful. So I'm curious, because we're talking about our libraries as communal space, would you describe sort of physically where in the building your library is? And then in terms of access, can people, is it a free-for-all, or can you lock your doors?
It's actually open throughout the day, but I do limit open checkout where students can come in and change out books to the afternoon for about 2.5 to 3 hours. I have a volunteer there, and when she's not there, unfortunately, I have to close the doors because my teaching area is nowhere near the checkout area.
You mean you can't be in two places at once? Why not? What's wrong with you? But it is... And your library, is it in the center of the building, or are you off? Or are you upstairs? Or is it someplace people pass by all the time?
It's someplace people pass by all the time. I'm right there in the front of the building on the opposite side of the office. So when you walk in, you either go right to the library or left to the office.
Awesome. There is something to be said for people always seeing that you're busy. And if your administration sees that you are always busy, no one is going to be wondering, why do we even have a librarian all day long? I mean, I'm just saying out loud what I think in my head. I'm on the 3rd floor in my building. And sometimes I think that because there are no classrooms up there, people sort of don't think of it as a classroom, but it is. So my goal is to keep this episode really upbeat and positive and full of coping strategies and ways to minimize unpleasant surprises in our library. However, it is early in the episode. We both get to have an opportunity to vent or rant about a time when our libraries were, let's say, misused as communal space. I realize as Teacher of the Year, you've been recognized as a leader in your building, and maybe you don't want to vent, but I'm happy to. So would you like to share when a time when you were particularly upset about your space being used?
I think times when I've come back the next day and I've found the furniture completely moved around, trash, crumbs, all of those things. I think every librarian has that one thing that really, really gets to them. Mine is the chairs being pushed in, and people in my building actually kind of poke fun at me about it because they're like, "Oh, push your chair in. Marshall wants the chair pushed in."
Let's have meetings in your classroom next week.
Yeah.
Honestly, when you think about this space, and then teachers, how particular they are about their own learning space. I think that sometimes even adults forget common courtesy. I will say glitter. Glitter is when the Girl Scouts and the Brownies are doing glitter projects or the Makerspace coding program after school. For me, it was when meals are being served in my library. And my very first day was the Thursday before Labor Day of my very first day 13 years ago. And I had never been in this building before other than my interview. And I walked in and they had a lovely brunch set out on what was the back of my risers, and we had juice and coffee and bagels and fruit salad. We had quiche, we had pastries, and it was lovely. And that was Thursday, and I got called out as a new employee to go down to HR to fill out some paperwork, and apparently I didn't come back because my training went all afternoon. I came back to school on Tuesday after Labor Day. Tuesday. Everything was still there. Everything. The orange juice, the coffee, the cream cheese, open, the fruit flies, which had now congregated around the bowls of fruit salad. Quiche, eggs left out since last Thursday. Yes. Welcome to your brand new library. I don't work there anymore. I'm not going to hurt anybody's feelings, but it was quite a baptism for me to being welcomed into this space, which is no longer my space. So tell me, I asked you about your teaching experience before becoming a school librarian, because we oftentimes, it's not unusual for teachers to begin in the classroom. I did. I was for 10 years. I was almost 10 years. I was a high school social studies teacher. So that requires a different way of thinking about your physical space. So tell me about your journey before you became a school librarian.
Well, I had worked in the corporate world for a few years before I stayed home with my youngest child. And during that time, I started, working with both of my children on their learning, and I started to really see myself as a teacher. And I had resisted that for a really long time because I come from a long line of teachers. And I kept thinking, that's not for me. I don't see myself that way, and it just kept drawing me in more and more and more. So I did start my English education program because I've always loved reading and writing, and I was almost finished with the program when I just had this huge change of heart. It just did not feel right to go into that sector of teaching. Maybe it was because I'd seen my relatives, the long hours that they worked and all the grading and all the demands being put on them, but I just didn't feel right about it anymore. So I did meet a friend in some of my classes, and she had proposed the idea, well, what if you become a school librarian? Because that's kind of what I want to do someday. And I had thought about it. It was already pretty challenging for me to go to school at that time with 2 young children at home. And I wouldn't call myself like your typical student. Like, I didn't enjoy being in school. But I did end up pursuing that later on, and I'm so glad that I did. My friend and I completed the program together, and we're both in our 3rd year of being librarians.
Wonderful, wonderful. In preparing for this episode, I thought back to my first library and what really were abrupt reminders that this new space was not mine. What can you tell me about your transition into this communal space?
I would say my first year, I did have a little bit of a difficult time adjusting to that because I spent so much money and time, arranging it like my classroom and putting all this effort into it. And then I would just have, people come in and move things around or take my stuff, and there just wasn't a big regard for it being my space. I had to quickly adjust to the fact that it wasn't just my space.
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, and people take your stuff. Because, if the books, the business of the library is sharing out books. Therefore, aren't you supposed to also be sharing your scissors and your hole punch and every one of those nice pens in that little coffee jar, the little coffee cup you have? You're like, no, dude. Those are my things. So no, I get it. I really do. A common complaint I hear about our libraries is that this is a dumping ground. Has this ever been your experience?
I've only had that happen a couple of times. It was usually over summer break. I would find like a pile of computers or some form of technology just kind of dumped in there by our technology group. And it really wasn't that big of an issue. I did ask them, like, what are your plans for this? So I need to find a place for you to put this. And so it hasn't been too bad.
Well, I know you're right. You sort of hold your breath when we go in the first time over the summer. And I'll be honest, I know there are people who work in their libraries during the summer. This may be an exception given that we've all been pushed out of our libraries right now. But, I go in August and I sort of hold my breath and I look around, and if they're waxing the floors, things get moved into the library just so they can, clean the hallways. Somebody who's retired will put all of the things they don't want. They've cleaned out their room over the summer. Hey, a little note. Hey, Amy, I thought you could find some use for these things. Oh, thanks. Because you haven't used them for 20 years. And now that you're retiring, I'll be sure to get right on that. No, and it's hard because, people, it's a big space. And therefore, people see it as it's not really encroaching on anything because it's such a big space. But yeah, I usually am greeted by things that people have left there over the summer, and it's, it's a little frustrating. You wouldn't do that to a classroom teacher. Let's put it that way. What about meetings? You ever come in the morning and you're like, oh, who was in my library last night?
Yes. And I've made the mistake of going and complaining to my administration about that, only to find out that it was them. Mm-hmm. So you have to be pretty careful, too, about voicing your displeasure at that.
Well, and you're right. There's a diplomacy about being vocal. And we'll talk about that some more, because I think when it comes to strategies, there's a better way to go about getting the results you are hoping for. At the opposite of extreme from being a dumping ground is that our libraries are a free-for-all. Anything that's not nailed down, like a bookcase or otherwise labeled, is fair game and free for the taking. What have you noticed?
I've noticed some of my nicer supplies like scissors, staplers that I use library money to purchase. If I don't put my name on them or media center, then they just disappear or they get broken.
Are is your book tape locked up?
No, it is not.
Okay, you might consider doing that. My own experience, I found the student council rifling through my circulation counter cabinets for tape so they could tape up their election posters. And what they had grabbed was my super expensive, high quality library book tape. And they had rolls of them. I'm like, dude, where are you going? That's book tape. And, again, it's this idea, well, I can take the books off the shelf. Isn't everything else available? So we'll talk about that when it comes to strategies. But yeah, unfortunately, people come up to my circulation desk and then put their hands over it and start grabbing.
Yes.
And it's not just the students.
Yes.
During a staff meeting, all right, during when the PTO comes and uses our space. So I found, because we're right next to the laminating machine, that unless the scissors that are supposed to be there are there, they're just going to come help themselves to mine. So, yeah, it's okay. So let's talk about being reactive. How do you respond? I am not a confrontational person, but what are some ways to respond that are not, that you're going to get the desired effect, but you don't want to burn those bridges professionally with your coworkers?
Well, I found that just sending out an email even and saying, just a reminder, I know there are going to be a lot of different baby showers and celebrations going on in the media center. These are my guidelines for how to respect my classroom, because I feel like it's so important to keep reiterating, this is my classroom. I like for it to be arranged a certain way. I have expectations of how it will be returned and how it will be treated when you're using it.
Well, and I think that's important. My understanding is you're there when all of these things happen. Is that correct? Because you are in the building full time.
Yes, I'm often there when they are going on, but sometimes it might run late and I might leave for the day and I have no idea what I'll come back to.
Right. I've mentioned before, I am not in my building every day. I cover 4 buildings. So oftentimes there will be a gap of several days or a weekend, and I will come back days after something has happened, only to find out, oh, wow, I guess somebody decided to have a luncheon up here, or I guess somebody decided to have a community meeting up here and leave everything the way they did. When it comes to being proactive, what are some strategies that you think we all should be using to try and mitigate this problem, to try and even stop the problem before it starts. But I'll let you get started. Is there some things that you've done in your library, in addition to sending out a note to your staff about your expectations and how things are meant to be used?
Well, if you could somehow also create a visual to display in the library and include pictures of how the furniture should be arranged, I think that's really helpful. Signage really does help. I've included signage at my makerspace centers and areas that I would like to be left alone, stating basically this area is off limits during meetings and events. I've also had to come up with strategies for like covering things in a pinch. I do have a large tablecloth that I use, and I just throw it over my makerspace shelf when I know that there's going to be like a PTA meeting or an event where there might be a lot of children, and it's tempting. It's really tempting, and they might view it as like a free-for-all for their kids to go get toys.
Yeah, they are taxpayers, and I think that when taxpayers come into our schools, in much the same way they walk into a public library, there is this expectation that as a taxpayer, I, in effect, have rights to this space as a taxpayer. And I resent that. I'll just come right out and say, I'm sorry, I don't walk into your space. But you're right. When the PTO comes up, and if they bring their children, it's one thing to set them up at a bank of computers. It's another thing entirely if you have a makerspace with bins and things that have pieces that could go missing. And it gets me anxious just thinking about it. Your things that are in your makerspace, which can be very expensive, and missing pieces mean the difference between something working and something not working. I will be honest. I did have an experience years ago where I walked into my building, one of my buildings, and the sign when you walked in said, PTO is meeting in the music room, daycare provided in the library. And it's like, I had this response. It was just like, ugh. And I was like, what do you mean the daycare is in the library? That's not where we put daycare. It's like, that's a horrible idea. I can't think of something worse. Put them in the gym. And I'm sure there are gym teachers who would disagree. So I found another successful strategy, and there's nothing novel about it, is labeling everything. Label everything. Yes. I have a label maker. Everything's been labeled, and in fact, labels that can't be taken off. So if you have a hole punch, something I found that works really well is nail polish and whiteout. If you have the brush of whiteout or nail polish, give that to one of your girls and say, hey, write library all over mommy's hole punch. But yes, I've become rather good at labeling things with permanent marker. The other thing I did, and I stole this idea from a librarian, was I created a workstation. I know high schools do this a lot because kids will come in for a study period or to take a test, but having a workspace with communal things that are on this table, help yourself. And it even says, help yourself. And they don't have to be really nice things. I find all the pencils that get left on the floor. I have a little basket, says free pencils, help yourself. And not your book tape, but having a tape dispenser up there, having a stapler up there, scissors, a hole punch. Again, label it, but put it in a space that isn't behind your circulation desk. Put it like out where people will walk by. And I mentioned locking up things that are really important, like your labels, your label covers, your book tape, your special materials that you use for book processing. When people have their meetings in your library and the meeting is over, they're gone, and all these things are left in your library. I'll tell you how I deal with that problem. How do you deal with that problem? Because I'm curious. Like, I'm telling you, the meeting ends and I walk in, or I'm, not part of the meeting, and people have left their cups. They've left their sweater. They left a notepad. They left a standing easel that doesn't belong to the library. What have you done in that situation?
Well, have found myself taking pictures of those items and sending out a mass email. You might call this passive aggressive, but I send out an email and say, library lost and found. Please claim these items, or I'm putting them in the office, those types of things. But I don't think people understand it's not just this isolated event. It's something that I think starts to bother you when it's every single time you have meetings, that it really starts to get to you.
And ditto. That's exactly what I do. I take a picture. I send out the picture. I'm like, question mark, yours? Question mark. Because these aren't things I can put in the trash. You leave a random piece of paper out, no problem. You leave an extra agenda, no problem. I know what to do with that. You leave your sweater or your tumbler, your coffee tumbler, or your water bottle that's special, and you're like, okay, come claim your things. You're right. Library lost and found is a great way to phrase it. So nobody likes surprises. So when it comes to scheduling this space where we work, how has your building worked out scheduling time in the library, whether it is a baby shower or it's after school PTO or it's those kinds of activities? How does your building deal with this?
We have a master schedule, and our school secretary is really good about sending out the meeting location and getting that on everybody's calendar. So I usually just try to make sure I look at every meeting request that comes out and see if it's in my space or not. I really don't have a lot of control over that. I did see that they were planning some type of Boy Scout celebration with pizza in there one time, and I said, hey, could we maybe see if the cafeteria is available? And I was able to intercept that one instance, and I really haven't had too much of a problem with those types of meetings being scheduled in there.
Well, and forgive me, but the first time you see a 2-liter of pop precariously positioned over, a bookshelf with thousands of books, you sit there and go, 7-year-olds should not be in charge of pouring that 2-liter bottle of pop over my books, which I have so carefully purchased. So you're right. I mean, it's especially when it comes to children eating in your space. I think you're absolutely right. I have, it is rather passive aggressive, but when our knitting club comes up and they start eating their lunch, I'll take my 2 big trash cans and move them right next to the tables. And I'll say, hey, girls. It's not all girls. We have our knitting club. We have a bunch of boys in there, too. I'm like, hey, guys, this is where your trash goes. Now, I have to be there for that to happen. So if I'm physically not there, no, you're absolutely right. When it comes to scheduling my building, we have to fill out building use forms. So when parent groups or clubs want to use the library, they do have to ask for it. So what I have had to do on some occasions is when I get there the next day, calling the building secretary and saying, hey, what group was in the library last night? Because XYZ. And I'll list off what had been left behind or the mess that had been made. And so I found that sometimes simply going through the building secretary rather than emailing the building at large is sometimes a strategy I like better, because I don't want the entire building to know that the library is regularly being misused. But it was interesting because you go through the building secretary, and once my principal marched up there to see, what happened, and started walking around, looking at the floor. And I think what I also have to be sensitive of is sometimes the evening custodian doesn't come. And that can be either attributed to an illness, an unexpected absence, or, and I've experienced this too, budget cuts. Sometimes budget cuts mean we don't have a building's custodian after a certain time. So being sensitive to that and communicating it with the secretary, because if the secretary is the one who's fielding all those off the building use forms, they can usually be your best line of defense. What is some advice you would give to a brand new librarian, somebody who's moving into their library and they want to get off on the right foot? You know, they don't want to have the negative experience right off the bat, but what would you say to somebody walking into a library for the first time and wanting this to be a really positive experience?
I would just say go ahead and try to form those relationships with if it's PTO or PTA president, anyone who might be hosting a lot of meetings in your library. Go ahead and just have a conversation like, how will this space be used? These are some things that are important to me, and don't just assume that they're going to know these things or understand how important it is to you, because I think it just gets overlooked. They don't mean to encroach on your space and, misuse it. Because
you've described yourself as being type A. I think that comes with being librarian. I think because we do expect, and our brains work this way, that things go in a certain place. Whether it's books on the shelf, whether it's the hole punch, whether it's your chairs being tucked in the way you like it. I think that all speaks to the way a librarian's brain thinks, don't you?
Yes. And I feel like we establish all of these things with our students and how to treat the space and put things back where they belong. And then when it's just after school and they're not in class and then they might be hanging out for a PTA meeting, then all of those rules kind of go down the drain, and you're thinking, what am I teaching them by letting them treat the space this way? They should always treat it the same way. And I feel like everybody should respect the space, not just our students.
Yeah. And I found that adults tend to be better if I'm in the room. I don't mean to sound rude, but when Kids Club, which is our morning program before school, when they use the library because their space is being taken by book fair or something else, the adults in charge of those students will take on the expectation of, hey, everybody, push in your chairs. We want to make sure we use this space respectfully. I'm like, would you have said that if I wasn't sitting here? I wonder, but I appreciate it. Somebody comes in at lunch and says, hey, everybody, clean up after yourself. Make sure we leave this space as we found it. Again, you'd hope that would be said whether I was standing there or not, right? All right, I think it's important to look at the bright side. There are a lot of advantages to having our library be used as this communal space. What did you think?
I think that it just comes with the territory, and you're going to help yourself a lot if you just embrace it and be proactive in those ways that we talked about. Try to see it as a positive that your space is really important to your school community, and you're providing another service, another way to service all of the people in your school.
Well, and what I like as well is when people are in my library, they are seeing what we do. They see the space. They see how the space is being used. We can showcase so much of the things that we do with their students when the families especially are up in the library space and see, oh, well, I remember in one time in particular, I went and asked the PTO for some funding on a set of books I wanted to buy. And then to make sure that when they did come up to the library, they saw all these books being displayed and, make sure that your library looks welcoming. It gives the PTO say, oh, wow, I can see how this is being put to good use. I know our PTO bought us new tables and chairs, and it was very important that we have those available right away because the PTO had paid for them. So, hopefully it encourages them to see the value, as you said, with our library. Before we go, we are finding ourselves with time on our hands because our buildings are closed, our schools are closed, the libraries are closed. What are you doing to invest in yourself professionally during this time?
Well, I've considered getting my Google Level 2 certification. I achieved the Level 1 last year, and so I'd like to do some more professional development like that and listen to podcasts like School Librarians United, and maybe read some books. I usually read the state award books this time of year, so I look forward to reading that and some other great books as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. I really appreciate you spending this time with us. Could you let listeners know where we can find you on social media?
Sure. I have a Facebook page called The Playful Librarian. It's actually a group that you can join. And I created that platform as a way for librarians to share like hands-on play-based learning strategies, because that's something that I'm really passionate about and focus on in my library. So that's The Playful Librarian on Facebook. And then you can follow me on Twitter at Sara G. Marshall. And my email is librarysari@gmail.com.
Wonderful. Well, listen, I want you to enjoy your day with your family, and I really appreciate you taking time to talk with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so grateful Sara could spend time sharing her perspectives with our listening community today. If you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. Next week is Easter, and like everyone around the world, my original plans have been upended thanks to the global pandemic. I hadn't intended on posting an episode. As luck would have it, I have found school librarians who, in the face of all the chaos and confusion, have entertained my requests for interviews. And I am excited to be sharing a great conversation I had with Laura Foy on the topic of middle school programming. I hope you will tune in. Stay well, friends.